Hey guys, it's Mari here. Today I am joined with a special guest named Menno Henselmans from Beijing Bodybuilding. He's quite well known in the field of evidence-based fitness and nutrition. And we wanted to cover with you guys, with Menno here, I want to go into a topic of how to gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. This is kind of the so-called holy grail of fitness. This is pretty much the goal of every single person that steps into the gym. How can we reduce body fat at the same time while building size? And there's a lot of myths and a lot of things we're going to discuss here. But first, before we dive into that, who is Menno Henselmans for those that don't know you?
Right. Let's start with what I do. I'm an online physique coach, fitness model, educator. I run the Beijing PT course where I educate personal trainers in evidence-based fitness. I'm an international speaker at various organizations, usually evidence-based institutes like Intelligent Strength, Norwegian Academy for Personal Training, associated with Fit Zonder Fabels in the Netherlands, which is like the largest evidence-based fitness organization there. Now the INFS in India, same kind of story. And basically, my focus is in bodybuilding, and that I define as gaining muscle and losing fat. So a lot of people, they don't consider themselves bodybuilders because of the stigma attached to the world, steroids and guys in thongs posing and the whole thing. But really, when it comes down to it, if you effectively look at someone's goals, often it is to increase muscle mass and decrease body fat percentage, which is the essence of bodybuilding. So bodybuilding, body recomposition, I consider those basically the same thing. You don't have to be a competitive bodybuilder to be a bodybuilder or train like one. So that's basically what I do. Mostly I'm known as an online coach and educator.
Awesome. Yeah, we're going to link to all of the Menno's stuff in the description below for you guys that want to dive deeper into his previous work. There's a bunch of stuff on your website, the articles, and a lot of people find value in that. And just to go back on what we're going to discuss today is that the topic of body recomposition. In the fitness industry, there's a kind of a pendulum swinging from left to right. So in one year, it's like, okay, everybody should aim to recompose. If you're a natural lifter, there's no point in going into a quote unquote bulk or go super hard on the cuts. Then on the other hand, then you have another years, people are saying, well, it's worthless to even pursue that goal because the results are meaningless. They're not as fast as if you just go the traditional route, which is essentially going a phase of reducing body fat where you're optimizing everything for that. And then you're going into a phase where you're kind of lean gaining, which is typically for most of the year. As a natural lifter, you get really good at cutting very fast. So, obviously you can gain muscle much slower than body fat. So I just want to summarize the current kind of state of the research and also your experience. So let's start off with that so people know kind of the context of what we're going to talk about, and just start off with the basics.
Sure. I think the most important thing to note when it comes to body recomposition is that for anyone that even considers him or herself evidence-based, is that if someone claims you cannot gain muscle and lose fat at the same time, that person is absolutely not evidence-based. That person has really just not read a lot of scientific research, because there are literally dozens and dozens of papers where people lose fat and gain muscle at the same time. The question really is not can you gain muscle and lose fat at the same time, it's who can gain muscle and lose fat at the same time. So body recomposition is possible. There's really just no debate being even possible about that for people that value evidence, because it is observed everywhere. And if you're a coach, then if you're any good, then you should have observed it in your own clients as well. So that's basically the first thing to note. And then in terms of who can actually experience body recomposition, that's a lot trickier. So in terms of research, most of the research, like all the research we have, is in untrained individuals. So not a big shocker there for a lot of people. If you get untrained people and you put them on a strength training program for the first time, you have them consume a sufficient protein intake, they're going to experience body recomposition. Now, what is a bit lesser known is that this also occurs in overweight people and elderly individuals, men and women, by the way. So let's just refer to that as an article on my site about the natural muscular potential of women. Short version is that, contrary to popular belief, women actually have the same muscular growth potential relative to their starting point as men. So in terms of percentage amount of muscle mass they can build, it's the same as that of men. We're probably not going to go into that because that's another shocker for a lot of people. Just read the article. But so we've got body recomposition in trained individuals, not so shocking, but also in elderly individuals. So 70 plus, a bit more shocking to a lot of people because a lot of people, they don't really even believe that elderly individuals can gain muscle mass, let alone when they're in energy deficit. So moving on from that, we also have a lot of research in athletes. Now here the studies are a bit mixed. So we have body recomposition being shown in quite high-level athletes, elite athletes even, but in terms of strength training experience, they weren't that advanced. So you have like the GARFA studies from Scandinavia. So usually it's for guys, it's people in their mid-teens. Most of your audience is guys, right?
Yeah.
So I'll usually stick to guys for illustrative purposes. Yeah. For women, as a rough guideline, often you just add 10% to the figure I quote, and then it's sort of in the same ballpark. So you have guys in the mid-teen, high-teen body fat percentages, intermediate kind of athletes, experience body recomposition. And the crucial thing here is that when you're looking at a study like that and you find significant muscle growth and body fat loss, as in that study, it's the average. So some people, if a study doesn't find this, for example, they find that there is maintenance of lean muscle mass, but there is fat loss, then you can be almost assured, if it's a large sample size, that some individuals within that study were actually recomping. Because you're going to have people that actually lose muscle mass when they're dieting, always the case, because you put a lot of people, you put them on a cookie cutter program. That's how research works. It's not individualized. You don't have a top coach. It's a very simple, basic program usually, not terribly high volume, so that everyone can tolerate it. And you put them all on the same thing. So it's not going to be ideal for everyone. And some people are going to get very terrible results. If the average lean muscle change is 0, that means a lot of people were losing muscle mass, which means some individuals were almost certainly gaining muscle mass. So if you add that to the research body, then you have quite a lot of more studies where people, most likely, at least some individuals in the study, were gaining muscle while losing fat. And interesting, we also have research on very highly strength trained athletes. So rugby players, for example, and these were really strong guys, like powerlifter strong in some cases. And usually they were still in their high teens, that kind of fat percentage. So we don't really have good research on individuals that were dieting to body fat levels of competitive bodybuilders and were really advanced. And then some people say, okay, so that proves that's not possible, but that's the old saying, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we simply do not have that research doesn't mean that it's not possible.
Yeah, if it's not official in a randomized controlled trial, it doesn't exist, right? That's kind of the premise that we're often coming from. And kind of the summary of, at least as from a coach's perspective, as I'm a coach or a coach, we know that, okay, usually what is advocated out there, three types of people can actually pursue a recomp goal and get actual results from it, which is, number one, an overweight newbie, someone who is in a very high body fat percentage, probably above 16% and just dieting down, and they want to just go through that newbie gains phase while they're also gaining muscle. Of course, that's possible. We know that. Then we have someone who took a training break, so they're basically a newbie, but now they have that muscle memory effect again, so they're detrained. And then we have the third category, which is essentially someone who's been training suboptimally. Maybe they haven't been tracking or they haven't been measuring their nutrition at all. They don't know how much protein they've been eating. They've been suboptimally training in the gym, maybe a cookie cutter program for years and years, suboptimal volume. And now the question is, when people go through these categories, and typically, let's take an example of an average guy who maybe is dabbling around the gym a little bit. He's probably in that category between, let's say, 15 to 18% body fat, maybe to 20, about skinny fat, not a lot of muscle mass. Is a body recomposition a viable goal for that person? That's the question, because I'm sure that a lot of viewers just looking at this, it's kind of that skinny fat situation where you have to build muscle at the same time lose body fat. So it's, where do you go? Often the question, should I bulk or cut? A standard question.
Right. So I would say definitely for the majority of people, because if you're looking at that kind of clientele, or that kind of group of people, that is almost exactly my base clientele. So it's the individual. Actually, they're a bit more advanced than what you're describing even. I think at least 90% of my clients, they have been strength training for a few years, and they've been getting their protein in. They know the importance, lift heavy. They know about progressive overload. The absolute fundamentals, they're all in check. And I would say definitely for the majority of people, you can still recomp then. Absolutely. And it's only when you get to really advanced levels, then it becomes really hard. And I've seen it a few times. For example, contest prep. Someone that's doing contest prep and deserves to be on stage, because you also have the individuals that do contest prep but really shouldn't. So when you're looking at really competitive contest prep, then I've seen it a few times, but it's really not the norm anymore, especially in the last weeks. Then I'd say that the majority of people, they lose lean body mass, because when you're getting to, as a male, the 5% body fat percentage zone, which is really close to pro level conditioning. Many people think, they hear of all these people at 2% body fat. No way. The essential body fat level for most men is about 3%. So if someone says 2%, then either they're on a boatload of drugs so that they can sustain that body composition while actually being alive. And even then it's probably measurement error, or most likely it's just measurement error. And I think it's because a lot of people use calipers and bioelectrical impedance analysis, sometimes also some other things like ultrasound to measure their body fat percentage. And all of those measurement instruments are notorious for underestimating body fat percentage levels in strength trained individuals, because the formulas they use, they are derived from barely trained individuals. So when you use them on an individual that has a large amount of lean body mass, it's going to underestimate the body fat percentage level. I think they're leaner than they actually are.
We know that every guy says I'm 15% body fat. That's there's nothing above or below if you don't see your abs.
Yeah.
That's
right.
Always. And the girls are about 21%. Every girl is 21% body fat.
Yeah. That's exactly right. This thing about when guys think, I don't really have abs yet, but I'm close to it, and that means I'm 15%. Well, no, reality check is that most men, when they're muscular, they have abs at 15%. Quite visible even, especially when you're looking at MySpace lighting, fully flexed, then you can even probably get a pretty decent six-pack on photo. At 10% body fat, if you're really muscular, then most men have a really good six-pack. And like I said, 5% is for most men as good as it gets. Yeah. That's really when the glute striations are coming in. You have fully striated triceps, deltoids, veins on your abs. That usually starts at 9% already. So really competitive bodybuilding level.
Yeah, there's an individual difference there as well, where the fat is going to be distributed. So someone might be leaner, less lean, and someone might have abs at 16, 17% body fat, depending on their distribution level. Some just store a lot of them in glutes, which is kind of my case personally. I mean, you can see my abs. Someone will say, hey, man, you're 10%. No way. I'm way above. If I do any kind of DEXA or even use a sculpt device, it shows me much higher. I want to bring it back a little bit to how would you be able to assess your training experience? Because a lot of people will say, well, okay, I'm an intermediate. And what I found typically is people who are saying that they're late intermediates, they're usually advanced. People who are saying that they're advanced are usually early intermediate. So people are very terrible at estimating their actual level of, I guess, on the continuum of experience, how close they are to genetic potential, which is a critical factor here where we determine whether they should perform a body recomp or at least pursue the goal. What's your experience in that? I mean, how would you be able to estimate accurately?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to the last question. Really good point. Illustrative example for your audience is actually yourself, because I recall that in the start of your program, you were also recomping, at least based on your measurements, all indicating fat loss and weight remaining almost exactly constant. And that stopped after a few weeks, but you were at least intermediate for sure. And, definitely beyond what we were describing earlier about someone that, has some vague idea of what they're doing. So definitely intermediate plus, I'd say. So that's a really good example, I think, for the audience. But as for your question now, how do you assess your training experience? That's a really good question. I have this question how many years have you been training, on my intake form that I give all clients. And it's really telling what the answers usually are, because almost all of my clients make a distinction between total training experience and how many years they've been lifting seriously, or they knew what they were doing. And that's a really good thing, I'd say, because that is exactly the first point I would make. A lot of people, and sadly researchers also do this, they give training experience simply in years. Now often in research they also give a secondary condition, which is often they've been strength training consistently 2 or 3 times a week throughout this period. So it's something like advanced athletes, and then between parentheses, have been strength training at least twice a week for at least 5 years. Well, if you look at the average gym goer, there are a lot of individuals who are quite consistent in actually going to the gym, but not really consistent in actually getting anywhere. So a really nice example is, well, depending on your gym and everything, for me, the gym where it all started for me in my hometown, I still occasionally go there because my parents, at least now, they're moving, but they used to still live there. And every few years, or at least once a year, I would come back and actually I train there. And it's really good because I've been coming there for over 10 years now. And you can see which individuals made progress, how they changed, who got lean, who got ripped, who's now a competitive bodybuilder, who's not there anymore. And you can see that a lot of individuals, it's like you still saw them yesterday. They look exactly the same. And most people sort of plateau at this intermediate level, and then sort of they don't really get anywhere anymore, and they also don't really do anything about it because they're still doing the same split. Like some individuals, there's actually this girl that has a very distinctive training program. Sometimes you still see her and it's like doing the exact same program, also with the same weights and everything. So then it makes sense that your physique is not changing if the stimulus you're giving it's not changing. But what do you want to do? So total training experience isn't really it. You want to look at the period where your body is actually adapted to the exercise. So basically the period you've actually been making solid progress. And that is tricky because usually you can't measure it. If you've got a client, then it's very tricky. They might say the time they've been lifting and knew what they were doing, but it doesn't mean that they were actually progressing. So usually what I do is I look at strength and muscle mass standards and compare them to an estimate of their genetic potential. So elite level would basically be closing in on your genetic limits. So you make the estimate, and for example, you estimate that they're going to be 200 pounds at 10% body fat at 6'1". That would be quite impressive level of muscularity. If you estimate that is basically 100%, and they are at 180 pounds, 10% body fat, then you are at 90% of that, which is still quite far away. Usually those last 5% or so, that's when things get really tricky. And you have to make a lot more advanced modifications to the program. Progress is going to be really slow. But you can objectively quantify it that way. So you actually you can put a number on it, basically. And that's, I find, is a really good way to assess how advanced someone is. Now, the standards you use, they're going to be a bit subjective. In terms of muscle mass, I like to use the work from, what's his name? He actually took it off the internet. Casey Butt, exactly. It's from the article I have on my website about estimating your muscular potential. Not sure if it's back online, but he actually had a really good calculator and formula.
Yeah.
I still have it because it's on Cybernetic Fitness, but it's not publicly available. So you can use that, see if it's still online. And some strength standards, there are various in use. Usually you find that many good coaches have strength standards that are quite reasonable. And in terms of really, really basic, the age-old saying of 300-pound bench, 400-pound squat, 500-pound deadlift is actually pretty good as a hallmark of where most people that are at least somewhat into strength training can gain. So that would be like 100% for a lot of people. You don't see a lot of people, unless they're powerlifters focusing on it, that can remain lean and actually achieve or exceed those numbers significantly.
So basically, what we can get from this, to summarize a little bit for the people watching, is that you can use your strength levels and your current lean body mass as a proxy to determine whether you should even pursue a certain goal like body recomposition. Because if you are so far from your genic potential, then there's some room there for you to still make a lot of gains if you switch to a progressive training program, which is, again,
Mhm.
something you mentioned there, is a lot of people are training, but they're not training progressively, which means that basically you're spinning your wheels in the gym, you're not pushing, there's no adaptation going there. And of course, as you age, it's probably going to go downhill if you keep
Yeah.
training the same. So it's not even staying the same anymore. Um, One thing that I guess we want to touch briefly upon here is, let's say you've determined you are that person who hasn't been doing the best they can, or you haven't had the knowledge. It's fine. Of course, we are learning, improving. How would you even go about setting up a body recomp? I mean, there's a lot of uh, advice out there. So if you're a little bit overweight, you would go with a smaller deficit and keep training, or you would just remain the same maintenance calorie level and just keep training like that. Potentially include some calorie cycling. What are some of your, let's say, if you had to summarize the basics for the majority of people that might work, something at least to try out. So of course we can't be for sure that this is going to work for everybody, but just at least try out and see if it does work for you.
Yeah. So I would say that actually I often don't create body recomposition programs specifically. The only exception to that is for women that have a regular menstrual cycle, because then you can use the menstrual periodization, which is probably a different topic entirely, but you use menstrual periodization to implement body recomposition. So often that means during the follicular phase, you emphasize bulking and you are, for the most part, in energy surplus and in energy deficit during the luteal phase. And then over the month, you can actually achieve a quite consistent body recomposition. But that is because you have roughly 14-day periods each of bulking and cutting. Bulking being an energy surplus over the week, and cutting being an energy deficit over the week. So, with that exception, often um, the goal is basically always to gain as much muscle as possible given the energy intake you're consuming. So it's not like you tell certain people you're going to recomp, you're not going to recomp. When you have two individuals and they're both in deficit, the goal for both of them, well, assuming they want muscle growth, is to gain as much muscle as possible. So often, um, this idea of cutting and bulking and body recomposition really isn't a very different category. You just have energy intake, and that determines whether you prioritize fat loss or muscle growth. But it's not like one individual is on a recomp program and the other individual's on a cut, because there's no point in not implementing the tools you want for body recomposition for the person cutting, because muscle growth itself actually aids fat loss. So the more muscle growth you are stimulating, the better the fat loss will be as well, because muscle growth is a very energy intensive process. So it basically increases the deficit.
Yeah, I mean, I understand exactly what you mean, because you wouldn't want to even lose body fat unless you're in the Biggest Loser show without gaining muscle. Then, of course, you want to do as much cardio as possible to lose all the lean muscle mass because that's why you win the
Yeah.
show, right? So that's a totally different category. But in general speaking, for someone who's interested in positive body composition change, they would want to maximize growth even in deficit. But
Yeah.
let's talk about a surplus here, and now let's talk a bit about lean bulking, and as well at the same time losing body fat. What's your experience in that? Have you seen that happen frequently, or what's the kind of
Yeah,
occurrence?
that's a good one. I actually used to say this was impossible, but theoretically it is possible if you do the math with the energy densities. Like I have the article on my website about energy balance myths. I think it's called "Why You Can Gain Fat," or why you can gain fat in a deficit. So that's the other thing. But you can actually lose fat, total fat mass, and especially body fat percentage while you are in energy surplus. And I found that out originally because I assessed the DEXA scans of a few of my clients and did the math on their body composition changes, look at the energy densities that are contained in muscle tissue and fat tissue, and then it came out that they were actually in energy surplus. Well, my goal was to have them in a slight deficit, and I thought they were because they were slowly leaning out. So it's possible, but if I look at my client records of this for the people that have like objective, high quality measures of body weight composition, it is rare. It is absolutely not the norm, and I would definitely say that even more so than gaining muscle mass in a deficit, that's always the goal. You should definitely not try to lose body fat while you are in energy surplus, because it's going to be terribly, terribly slow, and it's going to significantly limit your rate of muscle growth. So if you're going to lose fat, then often you want to be in energy deficit still, because it's simply the more optimal rate of body recomposition. So it's more of a nice added bonus that's theoretically possible than that, you have people saying, okay, you're bulking now, and I expect to see full six-pack over the next 6 weeks.
Yeah, it's not a goal, but if it happens a little bit, be glad that it did, right? So that's kind of what we're aiming at. Well, then let's bring it back to, let's say, cutting, right? So from your experience right now, basically what I guess my conclusion is that anybody who's not even close to that advanced level, you should be expecting, at least in the initial phase of the diet, let's say the first 50% of the diet, even 75% of the diet, to be able to not only get your lean body mass retained, but also increased, as well as your strength increased. Is that your experience? I mean, looking at guys who are further from their genetic potential, I mean, they're gaining strength throughout the whole cut, right? I mean, we're talking about, which also aids the recomposition, of course.
I would say muscle mass, it's definitely the majority. It's certainly not everyone, and especially hard gainers, when they get to, it's relative to genetic potential, but some individuals simply do not have the best genetic capacity for muscle growth, and then expecting significant amount of muscle growth in a deficit, even when they're only intermediate, it's not going to happen. So it's possible for the majority of people, but it's certainly not something that absolutely needs to happen for the program to be any good at all. Mm-hmm. Strength, however, is a different story. If you're not gaining strength, and this sounds extreme to some people, but if I look at my client records, it's absolutely true. The only two categories of people who do not consistently gain strength on a weekly basis in my programs are elite level powerlifters, because they are simply near the limits of genetic potential, and bodybuilders in the final weeks of contest prep. Everyone else is basically consistently gaining strength, regardless of whether they are in deficit or surplus. So as an example, if you're benching 300 pounds and you're at 10% body fat, are you going to set a bench press PR while you're losing fat? Doubtful. Although I've definitely seen it in a few cases. It's definitely not consistent strength gain on a weekly basis. So for most people, however, if you have someone that's benching 200 pounds, for example, for sure, that bench should be, as a man at least, and you have a somewhat normal height, then that bench should be going up over the course of the diet, for sure. And I think that is terribly underrated. I think a lot of bodybuilders have become stuck with this huge discrepancy between strength development and bodybuilding, and kind of like people sort of pussy out on a program by saying, I'm into functional training now. Okay, so not gaining strength is functional. No, but it's sort of like an excuse for yourself, and I've done it. I've been there. And during many years of my training, I was stretching more than I was performing strength training, and I was into all functional training, and I was performing a lot of rehab or prehab exercises, even though there was nothing wrong with me. And I was doing all these mobility drills and stuff for my squat, and I still couldn't squat ass to grass. And I had this idea that it was fine and I should just do more of it, foam rolling, all that stuff. But anyway, I think the problem is that a lot of people have this huge discrepancy between strength development and muscle growth in mind. And there they focus on only the pump work and all these things, and they forget that if you increase a muscle's cross-sectional area, so you gain muscle mass, it's actually physiologically impossible not to increase its force output potential, which doesn't necessarily mean you're gaining strength, but in practice, if you're not gaining any strength at all on a given set of exercises, regardless of how you do them, it is very unlikely that you're gaining a significant amount of muscle mass beyond novice intermediate level.
Mhm.
So it's like the person doing push-ups. At some point it just stops being a significant training effect for your body. You're not going to gain huge pecs as a natural while just doing push-ups. So
Yeah.
I think it's highly underrated, and it's this idea that people tell themselves, well, I'm focusing on muscle mass now, so which is why it's fine that all my main lifts are actually decreasing in strength. Probably not fine. They should be increasing.
Yeah, exactly. We're still talking about progressive overload as being one of the main drivers of hypertrophy. I mean, of course, you
Right.
can do a little bit of extra pump work, a little bit of other stuff, force negatives or whatever bodybuilders like to
Mhm.
promote these days in magazines. But again, at the end of the day, if you're not gaining strength progressively, you're probably spinning your wheels, at least if that's a long-term phase that you're
Yeah.
in. And let's bring it back to specific strategies because well, there's a lot of online articles. I mean, a lot of articles written on this. People would advocate things like calorie cycling. They would say, okay, if I'm training 4 days a week, I will be in a massive surplus on those days. Then I'm gonna add cardio on the other days and be in a deficit, and that's gonna make my bulk more productive or make my cut more productive. It's kind of that always. It feels to me that these people are almost stuck in some kind of intermediate purgatory where there's either not going in one direction or the other direction, despite
Mhm.
the fact that they're training really hard, quote unquote, at least from their personal report. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, is there any is there any way to actually do calorie cycling in a proper way, or how would you set this up?
Yeah, so basically you have two factors. For one, you should always keep in mind that the body does respond to long-term energy balance. So you cannot circumvent thermodynamics or laws of physics. Long-term energy balance is important. So you can only enhance nutrient partitioning, which means where your nutrients are going, whether they're going towards muscle growth or towards they're being stored as fat. And with that, you can make a difference in the ratio of muscle to fat you gain or lose. So I implement a lot of calorie cycling. The more advanced someone is, the more I implement it. And I use a couple factors of nutrient timing that I deem important, but probably one of the most important ones is that I cycle nutrients in line with the anabolic window. And first thing to note here, anabolic window is a term that's been very often misused as something that's sort of around the workout, being some kind of window, but it's actually a scientific term. Researchers often use it, anabolic window or the window of potential or window of anabolic potential, these kind of things. You see them in a lot of research papers. And it's the period after a workout where technically what researchers call the muscle full effect is delayed. Basically, what that means is that you can increase protein synthesis levels higher than otherwise, which is muscle growth. It's the accretion of contractile tissue. Muscle protein synthesis is occurring, basically the building of new muscle mass. So this occurs over a period that in untrained individuals can last over 72 hours, which means that if they're training at least 3 times a week, this anabolic window is basically the whole week. So that means there is really not much point in nutrient timing from that perspective. However, when you're getting to more advanced level trainees, we have a study by Mori that's really interesting on this. They did the same study in untrained individuals and bodybuilders, and they found that when they sandwiched the workout very closely between two meals, by having an immediate post-workout meal in addition to their regular meal schedule, then the trained but not the untrained individuals were in much higher nitrogen balance, which is a marker of protein balance, which is a marker of muscle growth, which very strongly suggests that for trained individuals but not untrained individuals, it becomes more important to look at post-workout nutrition. And again, it's not just pre and post-workout, it's this whole anabolic window. So for a lot of intermediate individuals, for example, this still includes breakfast the next day. And there was actually a recent study that also showed that the effects of meals on protein synthesis, they are additive. So having a large post-workout meal should not preclude also having a big breakfast the next day if you are still in your anabolic window and still having a very high ceiling of muscle protein synthesis. So then you still want high protein intake and supporting nutrients for that. So carbs and fat as well. So I definitely use that, and for more advanced trainees, it becomes a bit more simple in terms of training and rest days. But often for many people, I think it's very important to forgo this idea of calendar days because your body's physiology does not care about the Gregorian calendar. So it also doesn't really care. Well, there are circadian rhythm effects, but it doesn't really care about the position of the moon and the sun and the earth in relation to each other. It mainly cares about muscle tissue being damaged and needing to be repaired, supercomposition taking place, and new proteins being built. And it does that at a certain pace, regardless of where planetary bodies are. So this period is something that I think nutrient timing is important for, and it becomes more important the more advanced someone is. So definitely for an advanced individual, if they have rest days, a truly advanced individual here, then I implement quite aggressive calorie cycling sometimes, going to the point of implementing protein-sparing modified fasts even when for the meal periods, which I'm pretty sure that someone is outside the anabolic window. Because when you're outside the anabolic window, that basically means that you are not going to gain any more net muscle mass, at least when you're intermediate plus. It's simply not going to happen. People have this nice idea about they take a week off and they're going to gain a ton of muscle mass that week. Probably only if you're gaining fat. So there's simply the stimulus isn't there for your body. There's no physiological mechanism anymore in place by which the body would reasonably build muscle mass. So outside of these periods, you're not going to gain any more muscle mass, which is also why you're not going to gain 4 pounds of muscle anymore each month once you're past the intermediate levels. And in this period, so the best thing you can do basically is aim for maximal fat loss. And that frees up nutrients to shift towards the anabolic window where nutrient partitioning is better and they can be used to aid muscle growth. And there's a limited research on this, especially in trained individuals that especially does these kind of things. But we have the pre-post workout research from Mori, for example. Cribb and Hayes study, notorious because it's industry sponsored, but it very strongly supports the importance of post-workout nutrition for bodybuilders. Research by Bird found that also in bodybuilders, which is basically 3 of the key studies we have on actual bodybuilders, found that even after very high volume and intensity biceps workout, the anabolic window had basically closed, or it was between, I think, 14% of baseline protein synthesis in 36 hours. Uh-huh. So, and that was really, really high volume. I think it was something like 8 sets to failure, or even more. I think it was actually 4 sets for free exercise. So that's 12 sets to failure. That's quite.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, that's what people usually don't do on a daily basis. So in terms of the anabolic window, 46 hours means that you would need to do it at least every other day. So that's another thing we can touch on as well. This calorie cycling, this interacts strongly with training volume and training frequency, because basically you want to be in the anabolic window for the most period of time, which is why I implement higher training frequencies for more advanced individuals. Like I said, when you got untrained individuals, this anabolic window can last over 72 hours. It can actually be disruptive, especially if the training volume is high enough, to train that muscle group again within that period, because the muscle hasn't even recovered yet, and you're already damaging it further. So you can sort of work around it with blood flow restriction training, stimulating very different muscle fibers, these kind of things. But all in all, I don't see a lot of use for very high training frequencies in novice level individuals. When you get more advanced, however, and muscle damage is very limited, repeated bout effect has occurred for pretty much every exercise you've done. So they're very resistant to the training stimulus. They're not going to gain a lot of muscle mass. The anabolic window, this period of increased protein muscle synthesis, has come down significantly compared to their novice level. Then I think higher training frequencies are a lot more important. And again, it's a gray area in terms of the research that we have, but pretty much every study we have on trained individuals that looks at training frequency finds at least a trend towards greater benefits. And one of the best studies we have, I think it's now in the process of publication finally, but it wasn't originally, because it's from the Norwegian powerlifting team. The Norwegian Frequency Project was called, and they sort of like to keep it a secret. They got really trained individuals, the Norwegian powerlifting team, and basically put them on the exact same program training either putting all of their exercises in 3 sessions or 6. And the 6-day group basically made, or let me start with the 3-day group. It happened what you'd expect from elite level powerlifters. They either they gain a little muscle mass or some strength, but most is sort of stuck around maintenance in terms of body composition and strength. And the 6-day group, they actually performed a lot better, gained a lot of strength, muscle mass, relative to how advanced they were. So majorly improved results in doing the exact same training volume in 6 instead of 3 sessions, and 6 being basically full body training every day. And that's also what I do with a lot of my clients that are advanced, truly advanced, is at some point you're actually working up to whole body training every day or close to every day. And I found that this works really well. For a lot of people that don't know, Birgit Fagerli and I, actually from Norway, we experimented with this a lot, and it actually took a lot of tweaking in terms of programming to make this work. I personally got injured very often while trying to incorporate it at first. And it took a lot of tweaks, more exercise variety, how you program the different lifts over the week. For example, if you're doing squats and leg extensions, you probably want to do the squats on the day after the leg extensions because then there's not a lot of muscle damage in the quads. So these kind of things. And we found that it works a lot better with these higher training frequencies than traditional models. So I'm strongly supportive of that.
So bringing just a quick summary of what we said before, basically as you're more advanced, the window of elevated muscle protein synthesis is reducing, meaning that if you are looking to maximize nutrient partitioning, you might, if you're training just a couple of days a week because of time constraints as a more, let's say, intermediate advanced lifter, you might see a benefit of cycling calories in a way that you could reduce them on those days that you feel like you're not going to be training at all, like you can predict, I guess, from your schedule. Of course, advanced lifters, if you're or later intermediates, you can't get yourself out of the gym. I mean, it's kind of opposite problem. One thing that I want to bring back there, you mentioned for beginners might not be very beneficial for high training frequencies, although I do see a lot of people recommend a higher frequency of training because it kind of reinforces learning in terms of strength gains. So that's kind of, I guess, different goals, right? If your goal is to maximize, I don't know, your squat or your bench press or deadlift versus, let's say, optimizing muscle growth, hypertrophy, different goals, right? That's something I want to kind of put in the right context there. So
definitely. If you're a powerlifter in the making, then I see a lot of value in repeated practice. Still, probably I wouldn't put an untrained person try to do it daily. Because you get into this point where if you want practice, and I think that a lot of powerlifters is not really my area of expertise, although I've coached so many powerlifters now that I like to think I'm somewhat good at it. I found that a lot of people, they do practice or technique work or speed work with training intensities that make the movement biomechanics so dissimilar from the actual practice of powerlifting that it may actually be counterproductive. And I found this in a lot of clients as well. If they train their squats at 60% of 1RM, for example, deadlifts, bench press is probably the least sensitive to this, but squats and deadlifts are very sensitive. It just feels like a very different lift. For a squat, you can stay more upright. You don't have, you have a little bit less rest, rounding in your back. Is actually often not visible because you need like an MRI scanner or X-ray or something to actually discern the spinal movements. But there is actually quite a bit of spinal movement occurring during a squat, even though the back arc you have stays pretty much constant to the human eye. And if you look at these biomechanics, they are very different. And studies have also looked at this. The squat at 100% of 1RM is simply not the same movement as at 60% of 1RM. You know, this textbook idea people have about good form being slow and controlled. It doesn't work like that in practice, because when you are close to failure, by definition, your form isn't going to be textbook because, you know, muscles are giving out. You're very close to failing the lift. So it won't look pretty. And there are certain things, thresholds that you don't want to pass. You don't want your back to round significantly during a squat, especially not the lumbar spine and these kind of things. But it's not going to look as pretty as you see in some textbooks and these people. I know as a fitness model, when you do exercise demonstrations, it's actually very, very fatiguing. So often they get one model to do the shoot, and then they have to do the whole day. So that model has to do 20 exercises or something. And then you have to redo a lot of the exercises. And it's basically cardio because photographers are expensive and there's a crew there and everything. So it's kind of like a whole circuit training for the whole thing. And that means that individual, the model, is not going to do squats with very high weight. So it's purposely often from the model's perspective to select very low weights and perform the exercise in a somewhat lackluster, kind of slower controlled way. And they also, they don't want to get red and have their squat face.
Yeah. The grinding face. You don't want to get that on a front cover. Yeah, I mean, talking about training frequency, the Norwegian powerlifting project or study, whatever it's called right now, I've actually come across an interview. I think Drew Myraki did an interview with one of the lead authors or who did on that study, and they mentioned that the squat is the lift that benefits the most from higher frequency. So that was the lift that if you're interested in truly maximizing your squat, that there's a potential there for training squat more than 3 days a week. So that would be something to look into. But while bench press and deadlift, they said if they could redesign a program again, they wouldn't train the deadlift 6 days a week. Most likely.
That's actually exactly what I found. It makes sense because squat is the most technical exercise. A lot of people underestimate just how technical the squat is. As bodybuilders are concerned, that's about as technical as it gets, really. So, and the deadlift in particular, I found not to be very sensitive to training frequency because it's a very brute force lift. Doesn't require that much technique, and because it's so sensitive to the weight you lift, the biomechanics differ per intensity range. I've also found that, and a lot of coaches have found this, that this technique work, speed work, and all these things, it's such a dissimilar movement that it barely adds anything to the 1 RM or close to 1 RM lifts. And I found that for powerlifters, there's often little benefit in doing, if you do high volume, I almost always do cluster sets for the deadlift. So then it's a lot more specific to the actual task that you're training for, which is just one movement from a dead stop, no eccentric phase of the movement, no stretch reflex, very different from a squat.
Yeah, that's kind of what I guess I use recommendation right now for training, at least for those who follow. I mean, for those who are more interested in powerlifting, they would know Mark Zerdos and his work. His kind of philosophy also when it comes to deadlift, to training the deadlift is, okay, do a rep, restart, do it again. That's as close as you can get to the principle of specificity, because that's exactly what you're going to be doing anyway. It's doing that one rep as a powerlifter. Let's go into, as you mentioned there, training frequency and the recommendation. We have a little bit of time left, so we're going to cover a little bit. When you're saying, hey, training 6 days a week, often what people will say, well, full body 6 days a week, aren't you going to get overtrained, injured, broken in half, and other things? And people saw, let's say, a couple of videos that I posted online, full body training, and they were like, man, are you crazy? Why are you doing chest 3 days in a row? Isn't that going to cause overtraining and things like that? And I think there's, again, coming back at what we said in the beginning, there's a lot of skepticism with higher volume training as well. And there's a lot of skepticism in general where people are, I guess they gain the first 20 pounds of muscle as a newbie gain phase. And then they're like, okay, I shouldn't do more that's what gave me this 20 pound. Now I'm going to keep doing that. And obviously, we know that the volume should be scaled as the training age progresses. So what are your thoughts on overtraining and how would you kind of manage fatigue? Let's say when someone is training that very, very high frequency and trying that.
Yeah. So the most important thing to note here, I think, is that training frequency and training volume are independent factors that you should control. So a lot of people, when they start experimenting with higher frequency training, they drastically increase training volume. And that's the mistake. So injury risk, for example, is a lot more sensitive to training volume than training frequency. because given the same training volume over the week, training frequency itself generally only increases recovery capacity. And there's actually some good research on this. Also in Olympic lifters, training twice a day improved muscle activation levels, for example. A lot of people experience that when you're training very frequently, especially in a movement like the squat, it ingrains your movement patterns. So it greatly saves you or it greatly decreases your warm-up times. Whereas if you're only squatting once a week, it's like you're a stiff old man, and first you have to do 3 sets before you can even get your arms in a position. And then the first set is like you're going halfway down, and you're like, that's halfway? How on earth do I normally get down further? And then, it takes a few sets before you even get to parallel, and then you have to work up to the weight, etc. Whereas if you're training daily, you find that you can basically sink into the deep squat, well, some exaggeration, but you can sink into the deep squat, after 1 or 2 sets. So very different in terms of readiness to perform there. And training actually increases sleep quality. This effect is so strong that often in research where people train like directly before bedtime with bright light exposure, which is terrible for your circadian rhythm, decreases melatonin production, these kind of things, very bad for your sleep quality. But even then, the training effect is at best basically outweighed by these effects. So then sleep quality isn't affected. And almost universally, if you train at a somewhat normal time and you don't try to, you don't walk from the squat rack right to your bed, then it only increases your sleep quality. And the more often you train, the better. Also, movement quality is a lot higher because once you've done incline bench presses and decline bench presses, and then you get to horizontal bench press, typical kind of bro split, then the weights you're going to use, your technique, it's all going to be very crappy compared to if you were doing the flat bench press as your first chest exercise. So movement quality is also higher. And because of these factors and the fact that basically every session is like active recovery, most people find that they can actually handle a higher training volume, slightly higher at least, than if they were to do it more like bro split. So I'd say that given the same training volume, the risk of overtraining is actually significantly lower with a high training frequency.
And you would get adjusted. That's the thing that we need to point out here. You would eventually get adjusted. And of course, if you are experiencing that phase, initial first month of higher frequency training, might be feeling broken for a couple of weeks, but you will slowly get into that, and you will not only get your PRs but surpass them most likely if your training is now more optimal. Talking about managing fatigue, of course, we have to mention deloads, and I know you've been writing a little bit on that and been discussing that in a couple of recent publications and things that you posted. The common advice is, okay, take the every 5th, every 6th, or every 4th, every 8th week, or whatever it is, as a deload week, meaning you're gonna kind of try to lower the volume in half. Those are some of the strategies. Some say lower the intensity as well, or take a complete week off. There's even that being recommended out there. It almost feels like we're using kind of a shotgun approach, right? We're trying to get deload everything, while most likely there's only one part of the body that is actually overloaded or that is overtrained potentially. So what's your kind of opinion on deloads, and is there something like a specific deload for some specific muscle group?
Right. So the traditional kind of deloading method is characterized basically by being planned in advance, like you said. So it's every 4th week, for example, of the program. So it's basically arbitrary, and it's for the whole body. And these two factors both make absolutely no sense whatsoever, if you really think about it. So muscle growth is a local process. It's intrinsic, it's internal, by and large. All of these things, systemic hormone levels, central nervous system effects, insofar as they affect muscle growth at all, they are slim. By and large, we can explain most of the variants of muscle growth, even based on the very limited mechanisms that we know of how muscle grows and the limited factors that we have, interleukin-6, these kind of myokines. If we look at those elevations, we try to predict muscle growth. We can explain the majority simply from the internal factors within the muscle. So you stimulate your biceps grow. If you think about it, it's really simple. You don't your body doesn't make your quads grow because your biceps is damaged. So it's really commonsensical, but it's very different from tradition. And because of that, what I usually implement is what I call reactive deloads. So it's not planned in advance. So you don't say, because you're basically making some kind of estimate. Often it's not even individualized. It's every fourth week, regardless of whether someone is a novice or an advanced individual. Even though we know that rates of recovery and muscle damage are drastically different between these kind of populations, also drastically different between men and women, by the way, elderly individuals and the youth. There's no distinction made. It's just every fourth week or whatever the exact specification is. And that just doesn't make any sense. What I often implement instead is a reactive deload, which means that you have certain autoregulation principles for your progression, and you also have certain rules, basically, that govern when you deload. So if you find that you planned for squatting 100 kgs for 10 reps, and you only manage 5 reps, that is very far below your planned performance. So then the rule can be, for example, if you don't proceed, you don't progress as planned, or you can also implement a percentage decrease, something depending on the exact exercise, your equipment availability, the increment as it's called, microloadability. Based on these factors, you can come up with a rule set that governs when you should deload. And then in the above example, for example, you have got 50% lower performance than planned. Okay, so you deload, which means, for example, you do speed work if you want to practice your technique, or you cut down the weight and only do sets of 3 instead of 10 as you were planning to do, or you just skip all sets together. And you can also fine tune it based on that. Many ways to do it, but the core principle is that a reactive deload is based on a rule, and you plan the rule in advance, but you don't plan the deload in advance. Because you have many factors. If someone didn't sleep well, they may be experiencing more psychological stress. People greatly underestimate these kind of factors, and they overestimate how well they can anticipate when their body really needs that training, that reduction in training volume. Because as a nice research finding, for example, psychological stress, academic stress in particular, has been studied a few times, has been shown to basically double your recovery time. So whereas you'd normally recover within about 24 hours from a given squat workout, if you're experiencing high psychological stress, right, it's not physical. So you just have a lot of work stress because your employer thinks your performance is crappy, or you have an exam coming up. These kind of factors, it means that you actually need a whole extra day to recover from your squat. And then if you have this reactive deloading in place, then it takes care of itself. It basically normalizes your training volume over time based on the stress you perceive. And the beauty is that you can also implement this on an exercise-specific or muscle group-specific basis. Because, like I said, muscle growth is an intrinsic process, and joint stress is as well. If you're squatting, you have certain joints that are loaded in certain ways that predispose you to accumulate tissue damage, which may accumulate in an injury. For example, simple example here is you simply overload the patellar tendon, sort of degrade the tissue over time. This can predispose you to develop tendinosis or jumper's knee. And because it's just these tissues, it doesn't make sense, to stop doing your biceps work when this occurs. You just need to deload this specific exercise, not just take the whole week off. And I think that's for injuries and all these things. In general, people have this two-way mindset. Basically, you have two kinds of people. Very oversimplification here, but roughly said, you have two kinds of people. One kind, when they experience pain and stuff, they just train through. They're the hardcore kind. They just go on, and they tell me, okay, so my elbow's really hurting now, and I ask them, so how long have you had this pain? And they say, okay, about 2 months now. And okay, well, I specifically told you if there's any pain at all, you should tell me. And they're like, yeah, but I could train through. I could handle it. Well, that's not the point if you can handle it. The point is if your body can handle it. So That's basically type 1. And type 2 is their elbow starts hurting and they're like, oh, I should take the week off. So tomorrow's squat day. No, my elbow's hurting. I need a full break. Or they sprain their ankle and they're like, okay, full week off. They don't, the idea of going to the gym in crutches and do upper body work, for example, it doesn't even enter their mind. So there are very few people who can basically maintain the hardcore mindset and not pussy out on their program while still being reasonable and not just, being hardcore, but not just being foolish.
Yeah, well said there. It's like almost as if there's a little, just as a tiny little excuse comes up. I mean, a lot of people will just say, "Oh, screw the gym thing. I'm just gonna focus on something else now." And of course, the hardcore mindset there is as well something that I've put myself in trouble a lot because of that. Fever 40 degrees, I'll go to the gym to get the last 30 minutes before the gym closes because now the fever dropped down so I can just train that day. So it gets me into more trouble eventually. One thing that I like with the principle of reactive deloading is that you have a benchmark set, or the benchmark kind of you have a quantifiable measure for which part or which exercise what needs to be deloaded. And that's the beauty of it versus just as we said before, just taking a whole body deload, which often doesn't make any sense. You're missing out on potential gains. And I guess the rationale for the full body deload is kind of like what our Helms says, change the oil before the car breaks. That of course maybe in powerlifting if you're doing some kind of taper or something like that, and if you're predicting that the competition will be at a certain point, and you can kind of plan around that. But let's say strictly for bodybuilding purposes, for non-competitors, I don't see the point where you would have to deload your triceps and your bicep because your I don't know, your calves are sore, right? That just doesn't make any sense. So moving forward, I guess just one last question here for you is when we're talking about managing training fatigue, managing volume, what's your I guess what signals of overtraining do you look for except the benchmark? Do you look at let's say sleep interruptions, like something like a central fatigue versus a local fatigue? Is there something like central fatigue, like a complete breakdown?
Yeah, absolutely. And overtraining is real. It exists. But it's more rare than people think. And in general, I'd say that people greatly overestimate how important training and diet or their nutrition are for their overall well-being. For example, okay, one step back, the most important criterion, what all researchers use for overreaching and overtraining, is strength loss. If you are not losing strength, you are not overtraining. It's that simple. There is no way you're making, and I experienced this on a lot of clients, they're making consistent strength progress. They're losing fat, body weight staying stable, so all the good signs of body recomposition. And they're like, okay, for the past weeks, every time I get out of bed, I feel like I've been run over by a truck. And I'm like, how much are you sleeping? Well, okay, I'm sleeping about 6 hours. So you're chronically sleep deprived and you're confused that you wake up and not feeling well rested. Do you like your job? No, I hate my job. Okay, so you're chronically sleep deprived. You wake up with the anticipation of going to a job you dislike to perform that for 8 hours, after which you can relax for a few hours to repeat the same cycle 5 times a week. It's not the training and the nutrition that's the problem here. There's a lot bigger picture, lifestyle aspect that people need to address before they, look at these micromanagement of how many carbs they're consuming and these kind of things. And I think for a lot of these things, it's just the harsh kind of reality that people, they want it to be, how many carbs they're consuming. They want an easy, quick fix. They don't want to hear that they have to sleep more. Nobody wants to sleep more. And they don't want to hear that, they should change jobs or should consider changing jobs, talking to their employer, considering their alternatives, whatever. Often it's not that easy as you should just quit your job. But they should, reassess what they're now doing in life and if it's getting them to their goals where they want to be 10 years later. And it's the same with volume and training frequency. When some people, again, you have this distinction between the hardcore lifters and most of the population. They hear that, 6 times a week is better than 3 times, and they're like, oh God, I have to train 6 times a week now? And, same with volume. It's like, it's more that they see it as an obstacle of how much you need to do, and they're looking at this research of finding benefits beyond one set per exercise, and they're like, damn, I need to do all that work. And same thing with sleep. They don't want to sleep more. You know, what people do really like is to hear about a supplement, a magic pill. New supplement comes out, greatly improves fat loss while increasing muscle growth at the same time. Awesome. Taking a pill, that's what people like. That's easy. So, the hard truth is, this shit's hard. And there's a reason you don't see a lot of 200-pound ripped individuals in the gym, and a lot of people in the gym barely look like they lift, because it's hard and you need to put in the work if you want to look like that, or you want to be a national level powerlifter, or you want to be good at anything in life. You have to put in the work. Is that simple?
Absolutely. Well said there. Specifically on the fundamental part, a lot of, let's say on YouTube, I post a video on sleep. I make sure to post a video on sleep every month or so, even though it's probably repetition of the same research before, meaning that if you're sleep deprived, you're literally it's crippling yourself in terms of body fat loss, building muscle, pretty much everything, general happiness. And there's always going to be a couple of comments there. Man, you just said this 2 months ago. Why are you repeating it? I'm repeating it because it's such a fundamental thing that a lot of people haven't handled, similarly to caloric deficit, where still if you see the magazine, if you see a website, it's always a hack. How do we bypass the sleep need? How do we go with 5 hours of sleep? How do I sleep every 30 minutes 4 times a day and kind of get away with, which is research on military personnel where they have to survive literally. And I mean, there's a lot of myths out there. I don't want to go into a rant, which we can leave for some other time, which of course we probably have a lot of things to talk about there as well. Where can people find you, and as well as any final words in terms of I guess what we discussed today, what you would like to tell the audience?
Now, I think the last questions are a good message to end on. Got to put in the work, and you should make a strong distinction between what you'd like to hear and what the facts indicate, what the evidence points toward. And if you want to read more of my stuff, you can find it on BeijanBodybuilding.com. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and you can find everything there.
We're going to link all of that in the description below. One quick question. Are you planning to do YouTube at some point?
Maybe. I've got a lot of podcast interviews and stuff, so I'm sort of on YouTube indirectly. But no, maybe. Like, I like writing articles. It's like my for referencing everything, and I'm often, when I set up something for the first time, it's a very collected, systematic process. So writing suits my style better. But yeah, I do a lot of lectures and stuff in my PT course and in my seminars. So I'm considering it.
All right. All of it is going to be linked, PT course as well, in the description below for you guys that want to check that out. I'm going to try to dig out some research as well that we posted on body recomposition that we talked about earlier. Aside from that, thanks everybody who was watching this. We went well over an hour here. Very dense content, practical application and stuff like that you want to take out of this. Apply it. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you, Menno, for being a guest here on the channel. I'm happy to have you here, and enjoy Thailand, right? You're in Thailand right now? All right. Awesome. Looking to go there as well myself in the next couple of months probably. So we'll see. Yeah. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you soon.
My pleasure.
Peace.